very excited and very pleased to be welcoming today, this afternoon, Dr. Sahar Khamis from the professor at the University of Maryland, to discuss in quite an informal and friendly way what is happening today throughout the Arab region, the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, especially with regard to the press freedom, repression of dissent, as it has been exacerbated by the pandemic and the coronavirus pandemic. Sahar, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Wafa.
I know you've been doing a lot of interviews about this, and so you're a pro, and I cannot, I tell you, I really value your opinion very much and your knowledge about this. We write a lot about it, but it's really nice to hear from someone who knows exactly what is happening. So my first question to you is what I just announced, basically in general, what is happening in the Arab region with the pandemic? How do you see that the pandemic, or at least the coronavirus restrictions and lockdown, have actually exacerbated some of the problems that were already existing in all of those societies? And how has the government responses have been from one country to the next?
First of all, thank you so much for having me, Wafa. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you and with Inside Arabia. And this is a very important and very timely topic indeed. I think that with the pandemic that we're all suffering from in one way or another, came another equally dangerous and very threatening power, which is the power of the infodemic. And the infodemic means the distorted or misleading misinformation or disinformation which accompanied this pandemic globally. So we saw people spreading a lot of, lies, misinformation, disinformation, rumors, and that all comes when you don't have accurate and credible and true and realistic facts and figures around the pandemic and around the different factors that are actually related to it. And when you have regions of the world like the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, suffering from all sorts of other issues and challenges, educationally, economically, culturally, socially, politically, you have all of these layers of challenges and constraints, then the danger of this quote unquote infodemic becomes even greater and it becomes even more threatening. Why is that the case? Because in the absence of real, accurate, factual information, you're not always sure if the data that you are receiving, for example, from different governmental institutions or agencies is exactly the right or correct or factual information or not. Then this gives room for a lot of people to use social media platforms, not always in the best possible way, but in many cases in detrimental or negative ways, which could be filling some of these gaps in knowledge by things which are completely a myth or falsehoods or rumors. And we have seen a lot of that lately in the world in general and in the MENA region in particular. You add to that another pandemic, which is actually the increase in oppression or suppression in terms of freedom of expression and freedom of opinion. And some people might ask, so what is the connection? What is the link between having a health crisis, like a global pandemic sweeping the world, and having an infodemic of disinformation sweeping the world, and between having the pandemic of increased repression or suppression of freedom of expression? Well, the connection, in fact, is the fact that many governments would like to control the quote unquote the official narrative about their own country, about their own story. They want to make sure that there's only one voice which is being heard, which is being amplified, which is in this case, quote unquote, the governmental or the official voice. And therefore, they try to suppress a lot of the competing narratives or counter narratives, which might be challenging this quote unquote official narrative. So that opens the door for a lot of the things we have been witnessing or seeing in so many parts of the MENA region / the Arab world lately, in terms of closing down certain websites or media venues, or arrest of journalists, or expelling some of the foreign correspondents, and the list can go on and on. That's all an attempt to really have a well-orchestrated, well-controlled, well-crafted official governmental narrative, and to suppress any other voices of dissent. If you add to that another very important layer, which is in fact a double-edged sword, the technology that we are all becoming so dependent on. You and I had this informal chat before we started the interview about our reliance and dependency now on technology, which is becoming so much part of our everyday lives. And it's not just me and you, it's like, all our viewers and listeners and many, many people around the world. Now, is that really a blessing, or is it a curse, or is it both? I think it's both a blessing and a curse in so many ways. It's a double-edged sword. It gives us these tools to communicate and to stay in touch and to do our work at home and to do our interviews at home and all of that stuff, which is awesome. But at the same time, think about some of the the negative effects in terms of things like freedom of expression, things like privacy and invasion of privacy. That is very serious, because a lot of countries now are saying, okay, we have to do contact tracing, and contact tracing will involve a lot of use of technology. We talk about things like surveillance, and that also involves the use of technology. Well, some people can say, but that's awesome. It's good to have contact tracing, and it's good to have surveillance, because that's how you can track people and find out, if person is infected, who did he get in touch with, and who did this other person that he got in touch with also interact with, and so on. And the cycle can keep going on until you actually try to trace the spreading of the virus. That's the intention. But with that also comes some unintended threats and challenges. And that can be the invasion of individuals' privacy, the invasion of your private life, and the increased governmental surveillance online can also be a threat in and of itself, because it can be a way to try to track or to find out the location of, for example, opposition figures, or people who are activists, or people who are anti-regime, or people who have simply different opposing views and different opinions that may not always be necessarily aligned with the governmental official narrative, and therefore makes it easier for the regimes to crack down on them. So as you can see, the picture is very complex, it's very complicated, and I think we're going to be seeing more and more of these, pros and cons as we move forward.
Are there areas that you think, or countries that are more forceful than others in terms of repressing dissent and freedom of the press? Or are they all equally about the same? I mean, obviously, we're also having the problem of disinformation, even in this country, in the United States, as we said, the less amount of information people have, the more frightening the situation, and the more we tend to actually resort to conspiracy theories and to other stories and so on. But in our region, in the MENA region, it's more about really, it's not always just about somebody it's really the threat that these governments are actually feeling towards about their own survival. Are they, it's not just about, conspiracy theories that's happening, this and that. It's really the targeting of specific individuals who are perceived as posing a threat to the very survival of the regime.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Wafa. But what I'm trying to say here is that all of that has exacerbated, it increased, it heightened even more with the coronavirus era. So what you're saying is true. It was true in the past, it's true now, and I assume it will remain to be true in the future, that a lot of these governments, whether they are, republics or monarchs or whatever, they're very much worried about their own, position in power, and they want to remain in power. And therefore, part of this is trying to suppress voices of dissent. And that can really be said about all the countries of the region across the board, but with varying degrees and different forms and different tactics and strategies. But what I'm trying to say is that specifically, if you zoom in on this particular period of time, the period of the coronavirus, pandemic, then you see that there is also heightened desire on the part of many of these regimes and governments to crack down even harder on opposition. And the new technological tools, the more you master them, the more you have additional tools in your hands that you can, as a regime, use in order to trace and to track your opponents and to crack down on them. And for example, in this particular context, I want to say, for example, when you talk about the Gulf region, right? You talk about a region that has a lot of technological savviness, a lot of young people, maybe I would say 70 to 75% of the whole region, the Arab region, that is, are under the age of 30. But if you zoom in on the Gulf region, that percentage increases to almost 90%. Can you imagine, like almost 90% of the population are young people under the age of 30 or 35. Yeah. Many of them are educated, many of them are technologically savvy, and many of them spend many hours online using, platforms like Twitter, like blogs, like Facebook, and so on. Now, when you have the high per capita income and you have a lot of, affluence, a lot of economic resources, and a lot of technological savviness, that should be a blessing. It should be a good thing. But what I'm trying to say is that the double-edged sword of technology that we mentioned before is very visible, for example, in these cases, because you can also see how some of these tools, with the technological advancement, with the technological savviness, with the economic affluence, with all of that stuff, with the high per capita income and all of that, which is awesome in and of itself, but how it can also be sometimes used and deployed in certain ways which could be detrimental to freedom of expression or freedom of speech when these governments use such tools in order to track or to trace the opponents, and in some cases to sabotage them or to block their websites or to even track them in real life situations, endangering their own privacy and even their own safety. So that is becoming a very complex issue, and I think that moving forward, we will see a lot of research, a lot of media attention, a lot of attempts to try to regulate this cyberspace. I'm always asked this question: can we regulate this cyberspace? And I'm like, that's $1 million question. I wish I had an answer. Unfortunately, I don't. Nobody has an answer to this question up till now. It is becoming this new reality, which is overwhelming us and taking over our lives. But I really feel that there are more questions than there are answers, especially when it comes to things like invasion of privacy, threat to security, cracking down on freedom of expression online, regulation of the internet or cyberspace. These are big questions that unfortunately we don't have a lot of answers for up till this moment.
Well, I want to get to something that I just read, actually, quotes from you about some particular people that have been targeted, in some of the particular people that have been targeted during this period. And it seems that the virus has even been used to as a tool of greater repression, or in fact to get rid of some dissenters or journalists. The case of Mohammed Munir comes to mind, which is the one that I've seen. I've read some of your comments about it, how that has actually been used deliberately. Can you enlighten us a little bit about exactly what happened there? Do you see this as a condemnation, a death condemnation, so to speak, of a journalist that just was not, a welcome voice, so to speak?
I'm not really a legal expert to talk about the specifics of this particular case from a legal perspective, but I can tell you as a media and communication expert that this case is unfortunately not an anomaly. It's not a singularity, that we are seeing a surge, as I mentioned before, in cracking down on freedom of expression in the region as a whole, and that many journalists unfortunately have either faced similar situations or might be facing similar situations moving forward, which is why a lot of the freedom, people who are concerned about freedom of expression and human rights issues in the world as a whole and in the region in particular have issued some concerns and have issued some calls to try to free as many as possible of the prisoners in general, and prisoners who have some kind of political leanings or orientations, and of course journalists and people who are writing their opinion or speaking their opinion freely in the media. There have been a lot of heightened, I would say, attention and awareness about these issues, and a lot of calls to try to free them from prison, because it's no secret that with the coronavirus, if you are in a situation where you have a crowded place which has many people in a closed space, that is the perfect environment for the virus to spread and to be transmitted from one person to another, which is for some people, especially if you are elderly, especially if you have chronic health issues or certain health conditions or pre-existing conditions, that can be like very threatening to your own life and to your own personal safety. So it's not an anomaly, unfortunately, and we will see more campaigns trying to call for stopping such acts in the future.
Do you feel that the international media are being treated differently, because actually they're the one who report the most details about those instances?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there have been cases or instances where we have seen correspondence for different international or foreign media outlets, and also some international news agencies like Reuters, for example, the correspondents or the people who are working for them being expelled from some of the countries in the region. We know the famous or infamous case, I should say, of Ruth Michelson, the correspondent of The Guardian, who was expelled from Cairo because of a report on COVID-19. And it was not her own estimation. She was actually citing a study by one of the Canadian centers in a Canadian university. And she was citing some of the numbers and figures that contradicted the official narrative And the Egyptian authorities obviously did not like that, and she was expelled, as a reason. And it's not an anomaly. Again, there are, if you dig deeper, I always follow the news from, Reporters Without Borders and Committee to Protect Journalists and other agencies that are concerned about freedom of expression and freedom of the press in particular in the MENA region and the Arab world, and of course globally. If you follow some of these reports, you will find that there are a number of cases in a number of Arab countries within the coronavirus pandemic, where actually the foreign correspondents have been either reprimanded, or basically they've been told that you're not doing the right thing, or they've been called in and as one of my journalist friends calls it, like a yelling session, being yelled at and told that you're not doing the right thing, you're hurting the country's reputation or image internationally, or in worse cases they have been their license have been taken away and they've been expelled altogether. So there are a number of cases like that, and I just gave a few examples here and there, but there are so many more cases. If you dig deeper, it happened in Jordan, it happened in Egypt, it happened in a number of other countries where the government does not like what these foreign correspondents is saying or doing, and as a result, they can get expelled, or their license can be taken away, or they can be just yelled at, whatever the consequences could be. But in every case, I see it again, if we go back again full circle to what I said at the beginning of the interview about trying to keep the official governmental narrative intact and trying to resist any kind of challenges for this particular narrative.
So basically, what we're saying here is that the pandemic, if anything, has just made matters worse. That the situation being what it is, as long as we do have strong autocratic regimes where there is very little freedom of the press already, that this situation is just making it far worse.
Yes, I totally agree with you that unfortunately that's why we call it, like, you have the pandemic, which is the health crisis, obviously we're all impacted by. Then you have the infodemic, which is this inflow of disinformation, misinformation, and rumors that we talked about. And then you also have the repression as another pandemic, which is even increasing and becoming much more visible and much more threatening lately in the midst of this particular pandemic.
But it's not just actually the repression or the crackdown on freedom of speech also applies to all kinds of activists and dissidents, not necessarily the press or the journalists or reporters. There are actually a lot of people who, if even reporting from overseas, of other places, see themselves and their families being threatened, being harassed, so it's not just the fact that they are journalists. It's anybody who ventures to criticize the regimes becomes a target. And then you have some dissidents who are trying to do something about it. We just heard about the Saad al-Jabri's lawsuit against the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. We heard of the Mohammed Sultan's again, a suit in the United States against government officials in Egypt. This is a new phenomenon. What is your opinion about this? I mean, again, not from a legal point of view, but simply as a commentary on a trend that might be picking up steam, actually.
I mean, you can just see it as a tug of war. That's what I would put it, or that's how I would describe it. It's a tug of war between different parties trying to push and pull the limits of what is acceptable, what is considered taboo, what is considered, free speech, what is considered forbidden speech. You saw this tug of war. It's not something new. I'm just, trying to highlight how and why it has gotten from bad to worse in the midst of this particular pandemic or this particular crisis. But you're absolutely right. It's not just restricted to journalists only. Obviously, there are activists, there are human rights fighters, there are people who are protesters or activists or simply opponents of certain regimes in the region who have paid high prices. And some of the high prices went as far as losing their own lives, or in some cases being imprisoned, or in some cases losing your job and being fired, or in some cases having to spend the rest of your life in exile. And these are all very high prices that these people had to pay, obviously. And what you've been describing now, to me, is interpreted or could be seen in the context of a tug of war, as I said, between different parties, trying to push and pull these limits of what is considered acceptable, what is considered unacceptable, how much freedom can I exercise, how much control Can you exercise to try to restrict me, and so on and so forth. And I think this is a cycle that we're going to be seeing, going on for some time. I don't think it's coming up to an end anytime soon, unfortunately.
Do you see a change in the status of women at all? I mean, I know that you're an expert also in gender politics, if you will, or the human rights for women in the Arab region, in the Middle East and North Africa, as we all know, that's often something that is being attacked by different parties. Is the pandemic changing any of this, or the same is ongoing, the same situation is ongoing?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question. It's very relevant to my work and to my expertise. I'm actually an affiliate professor of women's studies, besides being a professor of communication at the University of Maryland. I'm also an affiliate professor in the consortium on race, gender, and ethnicity. So issues related to women and gender are definitely part of my research agenda. And it's something I would like to definitely talk about more, because a lot of my research that I'm doing right now is exactly about that. It's about how certain groups, especially marginalized groups in societies, if you talk about women, if you talk about refugees, if you talk about domestic workers, if you talk about people who have certain economic and social underprivileges, if I may use this term, situations that make them more underprivileged compared to others, they suffer even more in the context or in the midst of a pandemic, which is as huge and as impactful as the COVID-19 crisis we're all suffering from right now. They tend to suffer even more. If they already have economic hardships, these economic hardships are going to be multiplied. They're going to become even worse for them. Social issues are going to become even more hard for them. And we have seen evidence of that already in a number of countries where women are actually losing their male supporters because of the virus. Of course, women, it's not a secret, they are the primary caretakers in many societies. So they take care of people, whether they are working as 2/3 of the health professions, like, nurses. You have huge percentage of the nurses are, of course, women. So they put themselves more at risk of being infected with the virus and losing their lives in some cases as a result of being infected when they're working as nurses, or within the family when the women are actually tasked with the task of taking care of the elderly and taking care of the young, of the kids, and taking care of any sick family member. So that falls also on the shoulder of women, making them more vulnerable and making them more likely to get infected, but also less likely to earn sufficient income of their own, or to become more prosperous, or to become more affluent. So they have all of these, I would say, multiple layers of challenges and multiple layers of disadvantages, one on top of the other. And we have reason to believe that something as terrible as the virus, the coronavirus pandemic, made things even worse for marginalized groups, including women. Now, as a communication and media expert, let me also add something about the digital divide. Digital divide is the gap between technological haves and have-nots. Those who have the technological tools and those who don't have technological tools or don't have them sufficiently, right? So not everybody around the world has 24/7 high-speed internet, obviously. But that becomes even more challenging for people who are underprivileged, for groups and minorities like women, like those who are the poor, the people in rural areas, in remote areas. They have even less access to technology. So in this case, the digital divide becomes even greater for them. And in the case of women, you have a gender digital divide. So they're less likely than their male counterparts to actually have access to technology, which makes them even more disadvantaged and more marginalized. You see, so you're seeing this cycle. It's an interconnected, ongoing, vicious cycle of disadvantage, which is really impacting women in a very negative way. Having said all of that, I don't want the picture to be all, doom and gloom, and to give our viewers this very sad and very gloomy picture. You have to give them some light at the end of the tunnel, as they say. And the light at the end of the tunnel is a lot of societies now recognizing that we need women at the table. I always say my favorite proverb is, if you're not at the table, you will be on the menu. That's one of my favorite proverbs. And in the case of women, that is so true of it, right? I mean, we have not been at the table for a long time, and that's why we've been on the menu a lot. So, so now it's time to be at the table, right? We have to be at the table. And I think women are now becoming more aware of the importance of women's leadership. put women in leadership positions, and women have to put themselves in leadership positions. And by doing so, they can save themselves and other women from these detrimental and negative effects and implications, in my opinion. So I think as much as this is a bad and gloomy picture for women, as much as I think there is light at the end of the tunnel, if we truly pay attention to the importance of women's leadership moving forward.
Well, hopefully we will do that. Hopefully we'll do that. I hope that for the sake of Arab women, and I know there are some brilliant women in the Arab world and the Middle East, people like you in particular, and many young women, coming up, educated, knowledgeable, and I really pray and hope that they do find a brighter future and a voice, at the table, a seat at the table, as you said, not on the menu.
On the menu.
Thank you so much for your time, Sahar. I'm so appreciative. You've been very gracious and very flexible, and I really appreciate it. And I hope to have the opportunity to do it another time soon.
Thank you so much, Wafa. It's always a pleasure. Wishing you and Inside Arabia best of luck now and always. Thank you so much and take care.